He had come to the Far East with a message that he was on fire to give. But in the process of transmission, the East had spoken its message to him. He had gone out to change the East and was returning himself a changed man. Earl H. Cressy, Baptist missionary and author in 1919.
Hi, I'm Heidi, a historian and host of They Also Served, where we discover the lives of little-known women who made a big impact on Christianity in America and around the world. Few 19th century Protestant missionaries arriving in China realized that Christianity had first come to China over 1,000 years before they had. Even fewer realized how much they had to learn. Not just the language, and that would prove hard enough, but thousands of years of culture. They wanted to change the world. Most missionaries arrived with a racial bias and assumed that Western culture was superior to Chinese. But they had a lot to learn and would find that if they would succeed in their conversion mission, they needed to adapt their methods.
I learned from my late father, that the Li family actually came from one of the largest Baptist village in the southern part of China, in a Chaozhou-speaking area within the Guangdong province. As I was growing up in Hong Kong, I heard many stories from my father about my ancestral community's connection with the American Baptist missionary movement since the late 19th century. Because I think my father left his home village in the 1950s, because of all these political changes. So I think he settled down in Hong Kong and got married there. We were basically cut off from the old family connection. I grew up with all these kind of interesting stories. As I attend colleges, I keep reading and learning about the history of Chinese-Western interaction, and especially the history of Christian missionary movement. One day when I was looking for topics to do my master thesis, I came across some diplomatic papers, the American diplomatic papers on an incidence of Christian sectarian violence. The violent conflict between some local Baptist convert and their Catholic neighbors. And it turned out that I think the location was the hometown of my father. So I think from that moment, I decided, okay, that could be a very interesting topic for further research. And from there, I actually developed a stronger and also a sustainable interest in the history of the Baptist missionary expansion and also their impact on the local Chinese society, especially in their search for modernization.
This is Joseph Lee. We met him in our last episode. He's a professor of history at Pace University, and executive director of the Global Asia Institute. Abram LaRue, a former sailor and sheep farmer, was the first Adventist missionary to China in 1888. Adventists were latecomers to the Protestant mission in China. Methodists and Baptists had preceded them by half a century and had well-established missions by the end of the 19th century. LaRue arrived in Hong Kong as a self-supporting missionary. Church leaders had voted not to sponsor him, as they viewed him too old to learn the language. And indeed, the language barrier led him to mostly work with English-speaking sailors and merchants. He did become friends with a Chinese gentleman who spoke English, Mo Wen Chang, who helped him translate some Adventist works into Chinese. The first official Adventist missionaries, J.N. Anderson, his wife Emma Thompson Anderson, and his single sister-in-law, Ida Thompson, arrived in China in 1902. Ida never married and remained in China until 1931. During this time, she outlived two of her sisters who served as missionaries to China. Ida's younger sister, Gertrude, came to join her in Canton, but within a year she had died, perhaps from smallpox. There had been an outbreak that year in Hong Kong. The sister she had arrived with in China, Emma, became so ill from a tropical disease that she and her husband returned to the United States in 1910 for medical treatment. She died in 1925. Ida's missionary experience was typical of many Protestant missionary women. She primarily worked as a teacher, In fact, she was founder of the first Adventist school. Although Protestant missions initially sent out mostly men as missionaries, by the late 19th century that had changed. Women missionary boards had formed. Some were connected to particular denominations, including the Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, and Lutherans. Others were non-denominational. Many found great success in sending out single women missionaries as teachers and healthcare providers. Not only were women effective in entering homes where male missionaries could not go, they also were cheaper to send. They were paid quite a bit less than their male counterparts. One mission society in China found that by 1890, women outnumbered men by a ratio of 1.2 women for every one man. That ratio increased rapidly, and women far outnumbered men as missionaries. Like many other mission women, Ida's mission service centered around Hong Kong, Canton, and Shanghai. Why these particular cities?
So we actually have such myth that perhaps Shanghai was built out of this little fishing village in the mid-19th century. But then when we look at some of the historical maps, there were already temples and lots of structures in Shanghai in the 16th century. But primarily, Shanghai, I think, became a place of cross-cultural engagements, partially really through the Jesuits in the 17th century because they had some activities, but also the Chinese Christians. Some of them have studied Latin, some of them also acquired other different skills, and they became missionaries. And so they carried on lots of the cross-cultural aspects of mission in the 17th century. And then in the 18th century, they continued that trend. And then the 19th century, especially mid-19th century, Shanghai became one of the 5 ports opened up to the West because of British Opium Wars at that time. So Hong Kong was first annexed. And then under the treaty, there were 5 different ports being opened. So there were different international settlements. There was the British settlement, the American settlement, and also there was an international one. But then later on, they actually merged and became 2. At the beginning of the mid-19th century, Shanghai started to be more open, in a way, semi-colonial powers as well.
This is Suzanne Patrick. We talked to her in our last episode about Catholic Chinese women in Shanghai.
Shanghai is this really amazing global city where there are lots of people crossing boundaries.
Conversion was not always a straightforward process. Missionary accounts often make it sound like people were convinced to become Christians simply by listening to good preaching. And some people were, but it also meant breaking with hundreds, if not thousands of years of tradition, and not celebrating the same religious holy days as families and neighbors. Conversion involved a difficult calculus.
I did some research by looking at the American Baptist Missionary Archives and also the Chinese official archives in the Guangdong province. One thing that I learned is my great-grandfather on my father's side, they first came into contact with the American Baptist teaching. But of course, I think for that generation, I think the motive of their conversion was quite different from nowadays. I think they had a very pragmatic interest because that branch of the Li family or the Li lineage were involved in water dispute, land dispute, and also many other resources dispute with their neighbors. So at that time, because of the political protection and also the special treaty, the foreigners enjoy some special prestige and also privileges. And I think that kind of privileges also extend to their Chinese church members or the mission workers. So when they see the American Baptist Institution to be an effective protective organization, so they turn to the foreigners for help. They join the Baptist movement in order to access the American diplomatic resources in their local lawsuit against their powerful neighbor. And what happened was, I think that powerful neighbors also turned to the French Catholic side to access the French diplomatic resources in their dispute against the American Baptist congregation. So in a way, I think when you look at the early picture or the first generations of the religious conversion, they have a very complicated motive. And once both the Catholic and the Baptist Church established their institutional presence, you begin to see some cultural changes in their second and third generation. That story also reminds me that whenever I look at the missionary sources, I need to be very critical about what they mean by conversion. Maybe people join the church for the wrong reason, but later on, I think once they actually start to launch their Sunday school and also religious service on a regular basis, so you begin to see a more sincere and also a more genuine process of conversion actually took place.
Christian missions had followed merchant routes to China. In a bid to balance a trade deficit, merchants of the British East India Company had begun shipping highly addictive opium to China. Not surprisingly, the Chinese government was not very happy about people becoming addicted to opium or the outflow of money from China. Eventually, tensions over opium smuggling led to an outbreak of war. In the aftermath of the British victory, the British won trade concessions that opened 5 treaty ports and the island of Hong Kong. A second war broke out between China and Great Britain 14 years later. The war culminated with the destruction of the old Imperial Summer Palace in retaliation of the torture of the British consul Harry Parkes and the mistreatment and execution of European and Indian troops. Ironically, in destroying the Summer Palace, they were destroying some of the works of the Jesuits who had built a maze and some of the summer palaces in European style. Some early missionaries criticized British merchants for smuggling opium and tried to intervene to end it. But ultimately, missionaries benefited from it, as the concessions from the Opium Wars made it easier to enter China. And the missionaries, as foreigners from the same countries, became associated with European and American merchant activity, whether they liked it or not.
I think the historical experience of Christianity, it actually become a major target of political attack, on the political experience of Western imperialism, and also to promote the discourse of Chinese patriotism and also nationalism. So I think studying the history of Chinese Christianity was also a major part of the internal identity formation within modern China, especially after different periods of the revolution. But at the same time, I would say when we look at the history of Christianity in China, we must remember that China, since the late 19th century, it was actually the largest mission field for many American Christian organizations and also for many European organizations as well. The numbers of young Christian religious workers and also the amounts of investments that they put into China, it was actually quite remarkable. So it actually represents, I would say, the largest amount of international investment of manpower, financial resources into a single continental-sized country. When we revisit the history of Christianity, it also tells us a lot about the globalization, the social, cultural, and religious dimensions of globalization in the pre-20th century period.
As we discussed in our last episode, Catholic Chinese women did much to keep faith alive and proselytize in their local communities. When Protestant missionaries began evangelizing in China, they also found women were essential to raising up churches.
In every culture, there's always cultural expectations, and there are certain sets of rules for women. In Chinese history, the roles of women in society actually have changed quite tremendously from dynasty to dynasty. In the 17th century and 18th century, there were lots of high-status women. Perhaps they were more restricted in their homes, so traveling was very limited.
In the Chinese countryside, you also have some of this, popular religious vegetarian group or sectarian group that was also founded, managed, and operated by women for women as well. When you look at the traditional Chinese religious landscape, I think women actually play a very important role in some of this institution or semi-institutional religious life. So it was a kind of very competitive religious landscape when the Bible woman came in. And of course, I think before the Bible woman, I think the Catholic mission, they also have their own female teachers and nuns who also perform the same kind of role as well.
For Buddhist nuns and also for Taoist nuns, it was a little bit of a different story. So there's always space that some women were able to navigate that space. But particularly if we're thinking about the 19th century and the early 20th century, the Bible women, how could they knock on doors from place to place, actually travel?
The Bible women, they were actually family evangelists. Usually they joined the church when they were in their 30, 40, or even older. And they received some training from women missionary, and then they decided to work for the Western mission or Chinese churches as evangelists. And the Bible woman is actually a very general title that actually describes many different natures of work undertaken by this female convert. Most of them, they were actually first generation female convert. Some work for the women missionary as interpreter. It actually helped foreigners to cross the linguistic boundary to spread the religious message to women and children in a traditional Chinese home. At that time, it was still very much a patriarchal society, so it was impossible for a male missionary to access the private domain of a Chinese home. Women missionary and also male missionary, they always travel with this women evangelist called the Bible woman in order to speak to the female faith seekers, the female members of the congregation. Some of these Bible women, after they received training, they also joined the mission institution to work as a full-time evangelist in the school and also in the medical institution. So we also have Bible women who are very much the medical Bible women who spend time with the dying and sick patient in the hospital and also try to comfort them. We also have, in the early 20th century, you began to see some references to Bible women who work in prison. So we also have prison Bible women as well.
In our podcast notes, we have links to pictures of some of the many Bible women who served, many whose stories we don't fully know.
You also have Bible women who help opium addicts to get rid of their habit. So when you look at the nature of the work undertaken by the Bible woman, they really cover a wide range of area. If we look at the profile or the background of this Bible woman, they also came from very unconventional background. They were former members or even leaders of some popular religious sectarian group, Taoists and Buddhists. When they witness or maybe experience some supernatural power of the Christian faith, they decided to switch. But because of their prior religious experience, they find it very easy to take up the role of Bible woman, within a mission context.
Of course, miracles could go both ways. Olga Oss was a reluctant missionary. She was scared of riding in a boat across the Pacific. She didn't speak the language or know anything about the culture. She was also in mourning. Her infant son died shortly before they were called as missionaries. She and her husband never had any other children. Like many male missionaries, John ended up traveling frequently. Shortly after arriving in China, Olga fell ill. She realized it was serious and sent word to her husband. But travel was slow and he didn't get the message in time. As she recounted it, she fell unconscious and her servant thought she was dead. The servant contacted the American Consul General, who sent someone to check on her and realized she wasn't dead. She spent the next few days in the Presbyterian hospital. Chinese church members learned that she was in the hospital and sat outside the hospital praying for her. Her doctor and Olga herself credited their prayers to saving her life. Olga determined that she should gladly spend her life in China, and she followed through on her determination. She spent World War II in a Japanese internment camp. Her husband almost died, and they suffered from malnutrition and other health problems. After spending time recovering in the United States, Olga and John were undeterred and returned to China until they were forced to leave by the CCP in 1950. Olga trained several Chinese Bible women, whom she found invaluable co-laborers.
So that is a kind of very unconventional background for some of these very charismatic, capable, and also competent Bible women. You also have Bible women who joined the mission because of tragedies, abusive relationship, extreme poverty. They were looking for a way to escape from all these terrible things. And I think the mission church gave them a way out and also a promise and also a hope to acquire a better life for themselves. So I think when you really study the social profile and background of many of these Bible women, it actually revealed a wide range of spectrum of the first generations of the female Christian convert in China.
So the literacy classes and also Bible schools provided in the 19th century and also early 20th century really provided education for them. Even though some of the Bible women did not advance into perhaps high school or colleges, but that kind of prepared a way for them to support their daughters. And some of them, after they received education, they actually opened more Bible schools to provide opportunity for female education, but the non-elite class at that time. So I think that's quite significant. Because when we look at the Catholic history, lots of the Catholic Christian women we know, they came from the high status, the gentry class. But then when we look at the Protestant Christian women's stories, lots of them really, they started to receive education, but they also conducted prayer meetings and also they knocked on doors and evangelized in the village. So they really played a role in sharing the gospel with others.
We have records of many single women missionaries who traveled, gave Bible studies, and taught students in conjunction with at least one local Bible woman. Bible women, after all, understood the culture and the language better than any missionary. Abby Dunn and Olga Oss both served as missionaries to China in the 1930s and 1940s, and understood the need to train Bible women to replace themselves. 1900 to 1950 was a tumultuous, unstable time in Chinese history. The 20th century started out with the Boxer Rebellion. The rebellion was aimed at foreigners due to growing resentments of their privileges and cultural misunderstandings.
In Shanghai, because of the treaty relationship, it actually allowed the Western nation, especially the British, the French, the American, and also later on Japan, to establish their own territories that actually cater to the needs of their citizens. And so I think in the case of Shanghai, you also have a number of, foreign concessions where the British, the French, and the American and the Japanese, they also create their own governing body, self-governing body. So it is almost like a state within a state where they actually exercise their own national law over their own citizens in China. And many Chinese who were born or in the British or the French colonies, they moved to Shanghai and they were also entitled to some of this privilege as well. And also because of this special diplomatic arrangement, I think for the French missions, the Catholic mission, and also many Protestant mission, they also established their own office or sometimes even headquarters in Shanghai in the concession area in order to take advantage of these legal privileges.
Shanghai was not the scene of massacres during the Boxer Rebellion. But elsewhere in China, at least 189 missionaries, and far more of their Chinese Christian converts died. The retaliation by alliance between Japan, the United States, and European nations was brutal and destabilized the already unstable Qing dynasty. The Qing dynasty fell in 1911. The fall of the Qing dynasty left a power vacuum, resulting in fighting between powerful warlords. In the south of China, Chiang Kai-shek built a relatively stable government that existed between 1927 to 1937. But the invasion by Japanese of Nanjing in 1937 ended that. Being a missionary or Bible woman in a time of such political uncertainty could be dangerous, and missionaries knew they might not be able to stay. It shifted how they operated.
So, combing through the primary sources and some of the secondary sources, we were able to glean some of the activities they participated and some of the stories from perhaps missionary letters or autobiographies written by Chinese Christians. We are able to have some understandings of what they have done. Sometimes there are some almost hagiographical evaluation, that type as well, talking about their sacrifice. For example, during the Boxer Rebellion in the early 20th century, there were lots of Chinese Christians who have died as martyrs.
Once they actually joined the church, they could actually build on this pre-existing experience and also skill and knowledge, and to use that to empower the church and also maybe to advance the religious outreach of the church in the most remote area of the countryside. And what is more important is because of many of these Bible women, they were already middle ages or older ages. They were relatively free from some of this traditional family obligation. Their children and grandchildren, they all grow up. So they have slightly more freedom to travel, to walk around, to walk over long distance, and also to visit many different Christian families as well. I think when you look at the American Protestant missionary movement in the late 19th century, many of the mainstream denomination, they recognize the importance work done by the Bible woman, and they try to actually incorporate that practice into their own missionary hierarchy. So I think initially when you first look at the beginning of the Bible woman, they were all started by women missionary, single women missionary, and they have to be financially supported by some of these female missionaries as well.
Women missionaries often paid Bible women's salaries from their own pocketbook.
It actually came from the unofficial budget of the missionary movement. And many male colleagues always criticized, why waste the money on some of these elderly converts? But once they recognized the contribution made by the Bible woman, they began to incorporate them into the regular and the work hierarchies of the mission field. But still, I think the Bible women, they remain the lowest employees of the mission church hierarchy. They did all the hard work to build a church in the countryside, but they did not get much recognition.
While much we know about missions often centers in the urban settings, much of the conversions happened out in the countryside, not in the cities. So their work was very important in establishing Christianity, but was not initially very appreciated.
And certainly, I think they did not actually see an obvious career path to become an ordained clergy or pastor or church leader within the official mission church. But nevertheless, I think they helped the early missionary to reach the family domain, to build a Christian family in the countryside. And they also serve as a very interesting role model for some other Chinese village women. This is actually what we could do by joining the church, and also to have the opportunity to learn to read, and also to speak or to preach in the village square, and also in a kind of semi-public domain as well. Whenever we talk about the Bible woman, I think they actually represent earlier form of women empowerment in the Chinese grassroots society, even though they were actually being incorporated in a much more male-dominant church hierarchy. So it is a kind of interesting paradox. Whenever we look at the Bible woman, I think they symbolize the liberative elements of Christianity, but eventually I think they were all being placed under that patriarchal church institution.
We know a handful of these women who worked to build Christianity by their Anglicanized names. For example, Annie Lu served first in the Adventist Nanning Clinic. Nanning is the same city in which Ming Emperor Yongle had retreated while fleeing the Qing dynasty. Her initial role was unclear, but she was either a nurse or a Bible worker or translator. By 1933, she was listed as the secretary of the hospital board. By 1939, she was working for the local mission, likely working in the accounting department. During World War II, Annie Lu was one of the 3 women who bravely stayed behind to protect church property in Nanning. She survived the war, and after the war in 1948, was listed in the church yearbook as a licensed minister. Of course, she wasn't the only Chinese woman to work as an evangelist. One of the most well-known Chinese women evangelists outside the Adventist church is Dora Yu. While working as a physician, she was asked occasionally to preach at the American Methodist Episcopal Mission. In 1897, she became a missionary to Korea. Originally, she served as a medical missionary, but evangelism and preaching became more of her focus over time. In 1903, she returned to China and focused her work on ministry rather than medical missions. She funded a Bible school in Shanghai and published an early hymn book in Chinese. Her work did much to shape Chinese Protestant Christianity, as did Florence Lee.
She was the first ordained Anglican priest in 20th century China. She was ordained during the time of the Second World War. Many missionary and also Chinese clergy end up as refugees because of the Japanese invasion. Bishop Hall in Hong Kong, I think he ordained her and also give her the license to perform liturgy to the local Anglicans in circles, to the local Anglicans in the community. But I think after the Second World War, because of some opposition from her own church, the Anglican leadership actually withdrew that license. But nevertheless, she continued to serve in the local Anglican circle. And after 1949, she stayed in China and she became very active in the local religious patriotic movement. Based on some record, based on a case study done by Professor Philip Rickery, I think he discovered that Florence Lee continued to perform basic religious ritual and service. By the time when she got a chance to leave China to join her family in Canada, the Anglican Church actually recognized it is important to restore her license. She became an official priest again.
In the 1980s, when Adventists were permitted to worship more openly again in China, women acting in the same capacity as the early Bible women were key to restarting the church. During the years of the Cultural Revolution, Haoya Jia's mother continued to worship with her family in secret when possible. In the 1980s, her mother would share her faith with strangers she encountered, and eventually persuaded her daughter, Haoya Jia, to do the same. Haoya Jia's evangelism bore fruit. In 2009, her church had 3,000 members and had additional church plants that spun off her main church with an additional 7,000 members. Chinese women pastors continue to lead congregations throughout China. We may not know the names or the full stories of Bible women, but mission records hint at their importance in establishing Christianity in China, contextualizing Christianity to be successful in the local environment. And their legacy lives on in the Chinese women who continue their activities today in China. The impact of their lives on those around them was incalculably diffusive. Join us next week as we talk about Georgia Burris, a woman who knew the importance of translation.
They Also Served is researched, written, and hosted by Heidi Olson Campbell. Thank you to our guests on today's episode, Dr. Suzanne Jolene Patrick and Dr. Joseph Lee. This episode was produced by Heidi Olson Campbell and Heather Moore. They Also Served is edited by Nina Vallado. Cover art and social media is by Chelsea Ernina. Stephen Husett is our equipment extraordinaire, and this show was executive produced by Adam Fenner. Thank you to the Adventist Learning Community for making They Also Served possible.